Hudson was a big part of my life, and I lived a big life. Surprising when you consider how it began. I was born in Seattle in 1886 and grew up on a real tough waterfront there. I peddled papers, shined shoes, did odd jobs around a neighborhood saloon. Never knew much about my father, except that his name was Manning. And then when I was 14, my mom married a seaman, and I took his name, Ward. When I was 17, I ran away from that sorry life. And the next dozen years were filled with both adventure and misadventure. I tried being a sailor, a dog team driver, a gold miner in Nevada and Alaska. And eventually, I worked my way down to Mexico, where I rode with Pancho Villa as a captain and a quartermaster. It was in the early 1920s that I received what I considered a lucky break. Now, oddly, it came while I was in a prison cell in Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary in Kansas. But there I met a man by the name of Herbert Bigelow, president of the St. Paul Calendar and Novelty Company, Brown and Bigelow. I was in prison for drug trafficking. And Bigelow had been convicted of income tax evasion. Anyway, we became friends. And when I got out in 1925, I came to St. Paul, Minnesota. And Bigelow offered me a job at the bottom as a $25 a week apprentice in the factory. People seemed to take to me. I guess they saw me as concerned for their welfare. And so within 5 years, I rose so rapidly through the ranks that I was company vice president and general manager, reporting directly to Mr. Bigelow. And then in mid-September 1933, the event that dramatically changed my life occurred. When Mr. Bigelow and, a friend, along with their guide, drowned while on a canoe trip on Basswood Lake, northern Minnesota, near Ely. Well, I dropped everything and hurried directly to Ely to take direct personal charge of the searching operations. It was a real tragedy-filled time. Bigelow's wife had died just 6 weeks earlier. The Bigelows had no children. And so 3 days after his wife's death, Bigelow had rewritten his will, naming me heir to 1/3 of his $9 million estate. And then, just 1 week after Bigelow's death, the board of Brown and Bigelow elected me chairman of the company. I became one of the 3 principal owners of the company, took over the Quality Park project at Hudson, Wisconsin, and I inherited a fortune. Quite a long way to come in just under 9 years from that $25 a week factory job. And then in 1938, I met the love of my life, Yvette Saunders, when I hired her to become my social secretary. And then on February 29th, 1940, we were married in Prescott, Arizona. And we had a housewarming and wedding supper at our beautiful ranch at Rimrock, Arizona. Yvette had studied dancing in New York, and she had done some solo dancing in Minneapolis before we were married, but she loved the country life just as much as me. So on our Arizona ranch, we raised horses and cattle. At Hudson, Wisconsin, we owned a number of farms that I had inherited. We had a beautiful herd of registered Holsteins, at Quality Park Farms number 1, which later was the site of JR Ranch. We raised buffalo and pigs at Quality Park Farm number 2, just 2 miles east of Hudson, now the site of the Lighthouse development. That's where we lived and entertained. At our huge barbecue that had a spit large enough to roast a whole hog. Also on the site was a converted silo. And inside that silo, I commissioned the painting of a number of large murals depicting the adventures in my life, including my time with Pancho Villa. The murals could be viewed by ascending a circular staircase inside the silo. The staircase led to a guard tower at the top, and at the very top was a beacon, hence the name of the current housing development, Lighthouse. Unfortunately, the tower could not be saved when the property was developed, and our large estate home unfortunately also burned down during restoration when a workman triggered a fire accidentally. During my years as president of Brown and Bigelow, there were some real high points. We hired terrific calendar artists. Norman Rockwell was one of them. The company brought out a calendar featuring a nude model named Marilyn Monroe. Yvette and I hosted the Diane quintuplets here at our Hudson place. We became an international company. Yvette and I always supported Hudson. During the time that she owned the Hudson Star-Observer, we led fundraising efforts for the building of the Hudson Hospital in 1953. Many of my executives and employees also lived at Hudson. I enjoyed riding my horse in local parades and giving silver dollars to young people along the route. I gave a solid silver 28-inch long model of a Volga steamboat to FDR. It had been the favorite toy of Tsar Nicholas's son Alexei, who received it on his 13th birthday. It was a replica of a Volga steamboat created by Carl Fabergé, complete in every detail, including tiny electric lights and a music box. Bolsheviks murdered Prince Alexei and his parents and his sisters less than 5 years after he received the toy. Along with other treasures of the crown, the toy was confiscated by revolutionaries, and they in turn later sold it to Dr. Armand Hammer, who had supplied food to Russia following the revolution. For many years, the toy resided in the Hammer galleries in New York. I was able to obtain it, and I presented it to Franklin Delano Roosevelt on the occasion of his birthday, December 30th, 1943. The model was sent to the FDR library, where it was withdrawn after his death by one of his sons, Elliott Roosevelt. It was subsequently acquired by Malcolm Forbes for one of his collections. He had a substantial number of Fabergé items. And then following his death in 2004, when all of his collections were scheduled to be sold, the Fabergé portion of his collection was acquired by a Russian billionaire, and the toy was returned to Russia nearly 100 years after the murder of the Tsar and his family. My personal and my business philosophy was always, if you stop being better, you stop being good. And things were good. When Yvette and I were on a business trip to Los Angeles and stayed at the Beverly Hills Hotel on May 25th, 1959. That evening after dinner, I decided to do a little reading, and so I went to bed early. And that night at about 10:15, I died of a heart attack in my sleep. I sure hated to leave Yvette and the kids. she continued to live in Arizona. Another 44 years, where she died at age 93 in 2003. Her earthly remains are buried next to mine, near my monument in Hudson, Wisconsin. From a humble beginning to a monument in Hudson, it was an interesting life, indeed.
Good afternoon. We're here today in Hudson, Wisconsin at the old Lemuel North House at 903 3rd Street, 3rd and Orange. This house was built in 1884, 2 years before the birth of our guest, Charles Allen Ward. Charlie Ward, as he was popularly called, is a Hudson character of great note, perhaps our most flamboyant citizen. And we have here today historian Daryl Standafer, who does an imitation of Charlie Ward, but also has done a great deal of research about Charlie Ward. So on this June 21st, 2014 afternoon, I welcome Daryl Standafer and Charlie Ward.
Thank you, Steve. Nice to be here.
We've watched your presentation as Charlie Ward, but it does lead to some additional questions or points of clarification that I'd sort of like to bring up to add to this. And that one of which is, tell us about Charlie's excursion into Mexico and service with Pancho Villa. Now this occurred prior to the U.S. entry into World War I and was led by Blackjack Pershing, who later commanded the American Expeditionary Force in Europe during World War I. And they headed south to attempt to capture and punish Pancho Villa for incursions he made across the border into New Mexico. And so they got permission and they entered Mexico and ran around for a long time without much success. But during all this, you were there.
Well, obviously I wasn't there personally since I'm not he, but Charlie Ward was there, and your question is how did he get there? The record's actually pretty sketchy on why did he go to Mexico. And I can only speculate, really, Steve, that it was because of his sense of adventure. I mean, here's this guy that left home at 17 because he was disgusted with his home life or wanted a sense of adventure, whatever, and did all kinds of interesting things. So at that time, with the overflow of President Diaz of Mexico and everything that's going on there, for a guy in his 20s, that probably seemed like an adventurous thing to do. So he did wind up in Mexico somehow, for some reason, and rode with Pancho Villa as a captain and a quartermaster for 3 years. And you earlier referred to the incursions into the United States. That apparently was one of the things that he was tasked with doing, was coming into the United States and getting supplies, guns, ammunition, and apparently one time even assisting in getting a couple of American station wagons, which they somehow drug across the Rio Grande and then jury-rigged them into some kind of armored vehicles for Pancho Villa. So it was an interesting time, and I can only say that it probably was his sense of adventure that led him to do it.
Tell us about his economic adventures there.
Well, it really segues right off from his time with Pancho Villa, and it might even be indicative of his business sense, because the guerrilla band that he is traveling with is foraging off the land, and they're shooting cattle, ranchers' cattle. I guess you could say they were obviously stealing them for food and sustenance, but they would shoot the cattle and take what meat they wanted, and then the remaining carcass and the hides would be left behind. Ward realized that those hides had value, and so he convinced Pancho Villa that his payment for his services ought to be that he got to salvage all those hides. And so he was skinning the carcasses, or having them done, probably, and salting them and shipping them to El Paso, where he was getting $4 a hide for these. And during the time that he was with Pancho Villa, during this 3-year time, he was able to actually put aside in the United States a sum that was reported to be $70,000, which is no small change at that time, and that is a lot of carcasses at $4 a hide.
That'd be close to probably $500,000
Yes.
today in
Yep.
spending. Following his return to the States, he ends up in Denver,
Denver.
where he gets arrested. What can you tell us about all of that, which of course leads to his imprisonment ultimately at Leavenworth and the meeting with Bigelow? But he claimed that he had been set up.
Yes, all his life. Whether he was or not, I mean, the record's pretty sketchy. It does indicate that the authorities were watching him, whatever that means, for a period of time. And he was arrested in Denver and charged and ultimately convicted of drug trafficking. I mean, that was the charge. What's interesting is that he apparently was leading, shall we say, a rather party flamboyant life after getting away from Pancho Villa, and he had $70,000, and so he is sort of a popular guy and buying drinks and hosting things. So he maybe was a convenient target. I'm not speculating one way or the other than the serious point is he was convicted of drug trafficking. To the very end, he always maintained that he was set up and that he was innocent.
Well,
but as a result of that, he was incarcerated at Leavenworth.
He never had any drug connection prior to this or subsequent that we know of.
Well, that we know of. I've never found anything in the record about that, no.
But I suppose if he had enough money at that time, he could be either a player or at least a target.
Something.
Yeah.
Something.
So he gets convicted and sent to Leavenworth Prison, where he meets Herbert Bigelow.
Yep, he's 34 years old when he enters Leavenworth.
What's his relationship with Bigelow at Leavenworth?
Well, he is in Leavenworth when Bigelow arrives. He'd been there for some time, and I guess you could almost make the case that he decided to turn his life around. I mean, this is before Bigelow ever arrives, but rather than be bitter, as apparently he was, understandably, entering prison at the system, shall we say, the judge that convicted him, the authorities that arrested him, I mean, everybody, he apparently entered prison a very angry and bitter man. He decided that that wasn't going to get him anywhere, so he became friends with another trustee who was getting out in a few months, and this trustee showed him that if he would learn some things about electricity, which he knew nothing about it, but he went to the library and got books, he maybe could work in the electrical plant, and ultimately he did and became superintendent of the plant and really turned himself around from an attitude standpoint. Then when Bigelow arrives, he is already in a position of some responsibility and some respect at the prison, so he was able not only to look at this guy coming in and think, here's a guy maybe I should befriend, it might pay dividends down the road, but he also, and the record is somewhat clear on this, he was able to assist Bigelow in arranging an on-site stenographer and some secretarial help, and Bigelow wound up running the company during the time that he was incarcerated at Leavenworth from prison.
Our old friend and former town historian, editor of the newspaper, the late great Willis Miller, had said at one point that he thought that Ward became something of a protector for Bigelow in prison, and that this, of course, might well have cemented their relationship along with everything else that you've said. So Bigelow gets out of prison, returns to the Twin Cities, having left an offer of a job with
which he never thought would be accepted.
Right.
The record seems
Right.
pretty clear.
And then what happens? Ward's released.
Ward shows up. I mean, it's like, hi, I'm here. Remember what you told me? So he gets out in 1925 and comes to St. Paul. The place where Bigelow is living at that time was in White Bear Lake. So he phones ahead, tells Bigelow that he's arriving at the train station. Bigelow meets him apparently at the train station, picks him up, takes him to his house, and says, well, yes, I did indicate that there would be a job for you. So you show up at the factory Monday morning. I'll have a job for you. So Ward does, and his job is feeding raw rubber into a machine, and not apparently exactly what Charlie Ward had in mind, but again, reverting back apparently to a guy that tries to make the best of his circumstances, decided, all right, if this is where I start. And rapidly rose through the ranks, starting with that very bottom entry-level position in the factory that Bigelow never thought that he would show up and claim.
Now, Ward's rise at the company, Brown and Bigelow, is nothing short of spectacular
Absolutely.
in just a matter of a few years. But tell us ultimately where he ends up there in terms of being in charge, position, ownership, and those sort of things.
Well, it came as a result of Bigelow's death, which was in September of 1933. And as a result of that death, he inherits a third of Bigelow's estate. Bigelow's wife had died shortly before he died, and they didn't have any children, and so he rewrote his will after his wife's death and named Charlie as a 1/3 heir of his estate. Maybe he saw in Charlie the son he never had. I don't know. There's really nothing in the record that would indicate that, other than during this period of time that he's rising through the ranks, it appears that he probably lived with Ward here at Hudson. He also had an apartment in St. Paul, but it seems that they were forming a close bond during this period of time. And their age difference, I believe, was 21 years. So it could have been a father-son kind of relationship. But then when Bigelow drowns with his friend in northern Minnesota, Charlie not only inherits then part of the estate, but then the board of Brown and Bigelow names him president, and his life immediately, I mean, it just changes. He goes from an employee in the company, now he's running the company and owns a third of it.
Ever since Bigelow's death, there's been a persistent rumor that somehow Ward was connected to the death or responsible in some capacity for the death. Part of this perhaps has to do with the fact that Bigelow was up there with a friend who actually turns out to be the wife of another...
One of his executives.
Right.
Yeah.
So we've got that going on. But tell us about this rumor and what history tells us about it.
Well, I've been in Hudson now 25 years and have heard different people, make jokes about it, or this is what I heard, or so it's taken on this life. But you can easily understand why people would speculate that something happened. First of all, Bigelow's wife dies and he rewrites his will, and this is just 6 weeks before he dies. Now he's up there in kind of a nefarious kind of situation, and if something happens to him, all of a sudden Charlie Ward is going to inherit all this stuff. Well, lo and behold, he does drown. Contributing to it also is the fact that 3 people drowned. Probably. And I say probably because there were 3 people in the canoe. And it was Bigelow and his girlfriend and their guide. And the bodies of Bigelow and the girlfriend were recovered in short order. The body of the guide was never recovered, never has been recovered. No indication of anything that happened to that Native American guide. I mean, who knows? So that contributes to the possibility of speculation. The record does seem, seriously though, Steve, the record does seem pretty clear that Ward was not there. And the rumor, that I've always heard is 2 went fishing, 1 came back. Well, Charlie didn't go up there with Ward.
Right.
They were
He
not
wasn't
on.
even there.
They were not on a fishing trip together. It's very clearly documented that he was here, and he went there and took charge of the searching operations, and that's pretty clear. And it's also pretty telling, I think, that there was never any kind of criminal investigation. There was never any kind of legal action of any kind or investigation launched as a result of this. So the authorities seemed pretty convinced that he was not involved. I make no speculation one way or the other. I'm only saying what the record shows. The record shows he wasn't there. Bigelow drowned. He becomes president of the company.
Tell us then about a couple other things here. Because Charlie Ward has 3 children, the last of which is his son, whom he names
Herbert Bigelow Ward.
And it's tough
He was born in 1948. And yeah, if you had something to do with
a crime, something to hide.
the death of someone, I find it hard to believe you'd name your son after that person.
And also, Willis Miller had told both of us that at Ward's house, in the master bedroom on the dresser, was a picture of Herbert Bigelow.
Right.
Which
right.
would be, of course, constant reminder of the crime you had something to do with, if there had been a crime committed at all.
Right. I can certainly see how the rumors started. Based on everything that I've ever found or read, I think there's simply that, rumors.
Now, Ward has risen to the top here at Brown and Bigelow. He's in charge. He has a percentage of ownership, and the company is booming. But tell us about his political side, and how did Ward get so politically connected?
That's really interesting because there are several sort of directions that go from that. Probably the earliest political connection, I think, just came out of desperation, and it's while he's in prison. And he was, in fact, pardoned by President Wilson. As a matter of fact, from his prison file, and incidentally, I do have his entire prison file, which I purchased a few years ago from the National Archives. A couple of interesting things that come out of his prison file, and one of the things is a telegram that he sends to his then wife, which is another interesting thing I learned from his prison file. But in the context of this, he says, "Expect news from Washington within a few days for a happy Christmas at home." So apparently, while he's in prison, he's lobbying for a pardon. And he ultimately is pardoned by President Wilson. So that's his first, shall we say, political involvement. Not really involvement, but it touches politics. After he's out, sometime down the road, his citizenship rights are restored by FDR. That creates a whole interesting web of activity, and probably they're restored by FDR because he now is starting to rise to some position of prominence in the Twin Cities. Interesting what a position and money will do.
Also, this is the Democratic Party.
Well, and kind of the left wing of the Democratic Party. Up until the time of Ward's death, he's a convicted felon that happens to be working at Brown and Bigelow. But all of a sudden now he is the president of Brown and Bigelow and a man about town of some capital means. And so now some of the clubs and organizations that wouldn't have anything to do with him are accepting him as a member, and he's becoming an influence and a power broker.
What were some of those clubs? Do you?
Well, the athletic club, the Downtown Business Association, several of the business organizations that were involved in St. Paul at that time. But his involvement with the political side at that time was kind of interesting because somehow he became a friend of Governor Olson, Floyd B. Olson. And as a result of that, and probably because Olson knew the La Follettes from Wisconsin, he lives in Wisconsin, he gets acquainted with the La Follettes from Wisconsin. And all of this is sort of on the left fringe of the Democrat Party. So in 1938, and this is after his citizenship rights have been restored by FDR, and that's another interesting story because wrapped up in that is a gift that he makes to FDR in 1933 of a very expensive silver model Volga steamboat that had been the toy of the Prince Alexei in Russia, and his, of course, family was murdered at the time of the Russian Revolution. Well, FDR acquires this because Ward presents it to him. Ward gets it from Arm & Hammer's museum and presents it. And I've corresponded with the archivist at the FDR library at Hyde Park, and I asked specifically, is there any record that this was given to FDR in anticipation of or in payment for the restoration of the citizenship rights? There's no documentation that that occurred, but the archivist said it could well have happened. We just have no record of it. So, as a result of him doing that with FDR, they apparently at least were acquainted enough that FDR invites him to the White House in 1938, and he goes and he has dinner with FDR on the presidential yacht of Sequoia. Was that
I'm not
the
sure.
name of it? Yep. Anyway, and comes back to Hudson a few weeks later and invites Olson and Benson and the La Follettes to his place here at Hudson. Well, apparently a big brouhaha comes up. I've read a couple of articles in the newspaper from that, and they almost got into a fist fight. But it's pretty easy to speculate that FDR kind of orchestrated him bringing them together because FDR was concerned about this left-wing movement in 38 siphoning off votes. Mm-hmm. So that kind of destroyed that coalition between the Minnesota left-wing progressives and the Wisconsin left-wing progressives, the Olson, the Bensons, and the La Follettes, and entering the picture then, with Charlie Ward getting involved in assisting him, is Harold Stassen, who was elected governor then in 1938. And it removed the threat to FDR's reelection campaign that this siphoning off of votes would occur. So it's very fascinating that he seemed to me maybe be almost used as a pawn. There was a very interesting newspaper magazine that I ran across and published in the Saturday Evening Post, which doesn't exist anymore, but a big-time magazine at one time. And this is September 1938, and the title of the article is "The Third Party Gets a Rich Uncle." And this is a lengthy article about Charlie Ward and his involvement, apparently at the direction of FDR, in helping stop this third-party challenge to his reelection. Yeah.
A different tact here from the politics. Tell us about Ward's ownership of various farms here in the Hudson area. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure that people realize how extensive his holdings really were.
Yeah.
Mostly to the southeast of east and south of town here.
Yes. Well, there apparently were at least 6 Quality Park farms. Quality Park farms 1 and 2 were right adjacent to Hudson. There was a dairy farm where the JR Ranch later was, as Quality Park Farms number 2. Number 1 is where the Lighthouse development is, just east of Hudson, and that's where the estate house was at. But you're right, at the time of Bigelow's death, that's part of what Ward inherited, all this farmland at Hudson. So it apparently was 6 farms with approximately 2,000 acres of land that he inherited. So all of a sudden, in one fell swoop, he became a substantial landowner in St. Croix County, And number of these farms are still documented where they're at, and the record of property ownership. And
Well, he used to host.
he was a gentleman around town.
He used to host a number of parties,
Yes.
not only for the employees at Brown and Bigelow, but also events where celebrities
Right.
of some note, at
Right.
least in those days, came. Do you remember some of the celebrities?
Well, I was able to find in one newspaper article that he had a Christmas party that apparently was for a combination of some of his executives and people from town, and invited them to this big blowout, and had invited Gene Autry. So Gene Autry came and performed and sang for all these guests. And Charlie loved, apparently, to be the center of attention and to entertain and to be generous with his money. So the sales meetings, a number of the sales meetings were held at a converted barn at what is now the JR Ranch. And he had a conference center, and it brought executives out there. And there were also a number of large parties at the estate home on Stage Line Drive, just east of the Hudson Hospital, where he had a huge outdoor barbecue. It was all Pennsylvania blue slate, and it was probably, I saw it before it all got destroyed. It probably was 50, 60,000 square feet of hard surface area. I mean, it was just a huge outdoor patio where they entertained.
Well, you mentioned the hospital. The wards were particularly important in promoting the development of the first Hudson Hospital,
Right.
and the acquisition of the local newspaper.
Right.
What can you tell us about that?
Well, Yvette, Charlie's wife, assumed ownership of the paper in 1951 and owned the paper for a number of years. And in 53, when the Hudson Hospital was built, 1953, they personally led the fundraising effort, probably contributed a substantial sum. I have no idea what that amount was, but they led that effort for the building of the Hudson Hospital. And from her vantage point as newspaper owner, she could promote it, get behind it, get the community going, give it all kinds of publicity. And so they were very instrumental in not only that, but other community activities. The record is pretty clear that they really were Hudson boosters.
Well, when they acquired the newspaper, of course, that's where they acquired an employee, our old friend Willis Miller.
Willis Miller.
And I remember Willis telling me that he would be working on a Saturday, and Charlie's car with driver and Charlie aboard would arrive at the newspaper office, and Charlie would come in and signal Willis, let's go have a drink, let's go have lunch. And if Willis had any work to do, Charlie would just say, never mind, you can do it later. And Willis was delighted to join Charlie Ward.
So it probably wasn't a suggestion, it was an order, huh?
Yeah. Willingly obeyed.
Yeah.
We'd mentioned in talking earlier about Ward's children. Tell us what you can about his 3 children.
3 children that we know of. And I say that only because there are a lot of mysteries about Charlie Ward, and some things that we'll probably never know. But as I earlier indicated, I learned from his prison file that he was married. His wife lived in Park City, Utah at the time he was incarcerated. She unfortunately died while he was in prison. But the telegrams that he sent to her have some interesting references, and they refer to her and the kids. And in this one, love to you, love and kisses to you and the kids, greet the kiddies. So whether or not those were his children or whether he married a lady that has children, I've not been able to find out. But it's, again, a mystery. It's curious. He married Yvette Saunders, who was the former wife of Charlie Saunders, Charlie's Cafe Exceptional in the
Famous
Twin
restaurant in downtown
Famous
Minneapolis.
restaurateur in the cities. This was his ex-wife, and they married in 1940. And the indication is that this was the love of his life. I mean, I'm not belittling that. I'm saying he apparently was just tremendously smitten by Yvette. And they did have 3 children, 2 daughters, Kiki and Vida, and then their only son, Herbert Bigelow. And he doted on those kids, the record shows. He was just a proud dad, and I enjoyed those kids and featured them in his Christmas cards that were mailed out each year, the Brown and Bigelow, incidentally, Christmas cards. And so the record that is documentable is that he had 3 children.
If he'd lived longer, it sounds like he would have been even prouder of his son, who became a prominent doctor.
Outstanding doctor. I, just as an aside, have looked at his biography and the list of research articles and data that he has published. An outstanding research doctor. And so that's Charlie's legacy.
In conclusion, is there anything that you'd like to say about Charlie Ward? Any other observations or feelings? Willis, I remember, had said to me that Ward seemed to be the kind of person that you either loved or hated. You had this dividing line. Obviously, Willis was in the camp of those that really, really appreciated Charlie Ward, and he sounds like a very interesting character. But is there anything you'd care to add here?
Well, he apparently was a very outstanding businessman. I mean, at the time of Bigelow's death, Brown and Bigelow, the company, was apparently being run almost as a plaything or a toy for Herbert Bigelow, and I mean, frankly, was losing money. Charlie turned it around and turned it into a substantially successful and profitable company. Now, he had no business background. I mean, here's this roustabout guy that did all kinds of adventurous things and is a convicted felon, but obviously had a lot of intelligence and basic common sense, and was able to demonstrate that he was an accomplished businessman and turned that company around. The fact that he got involved with a number of outstanding and upstanding citizens in other activities demonstrates that he was a man of strong beliefs, a lot of self-confidence, and able to do a pretty good job of turning around a life that, by his own admission, started out on a pretty shabby basis, and he's in prison at 34 and thinks his life is over, and ultimately becomes a very successful man, dying in 1959, just 3 days short of his 73rd birthday. So a pretty accomplished guy. But some mysteries, some mysteries that surround Charlie to this day. And I like mysteries because they leave things hanging. The details of Bigelow's death, I don't speculate that he was involved, but it's a mystery. One of the mysteries, reach over and give me those handcuffs. I find that kind of an intriguing mystery. One of the things that Charlie did was hire other convicted felons. He believed in giving a second chance to people, so there were a lot of felons that worked at Brown and Bigelow. Well, when his estate house that he inherited from Ward burned down, unfortunately, at the time of restoration, in the ruins were these handcuffs. What's a mystery? I have no idea why they were there, but why would there be a set of handcuffs in his house? Another mystery is that his motto apparently was live and let live. And we've all heard that, live and let live. But if you go up to the Hudson Cemetery and look at his big monument, that's not what it says. It says, let live and live. Now, I think that's a mystery. Was it a mistake? Was it on purpose? If it was on purpose, why? That's a mystery. I don't know. And another interesting mystery that's going on right now, well, not so much a mystery, but I find it an interesting sidebar. I was able, as a result of all of this, to communicate with Hyde Park about the toy that went there, and the National Archives and get his prison file. One of the things that the executives at Brown and Bigelow always did was give him a substantial Christmas present. And I mean, substantial. And in 1949, the gift was a Dodge Power Wagon, a four-wheel drive Dodge Power Wagon Woody. It had what was called a Campbell body on it, a Woody. And apparently there were 50 of them made, only 50. 49 of them were shipped to the Middle East for some reason. I don't know why. That's where they went. One was given to Charlie Ward by his employees. So apparently there's only one in existence in the United States. Well, that's got an interesting story. I earlier indicated that Yvette lived longer than Charlie, and she continued to live in Arizona. She died in 2003 at the age of 93. When Charlie died, this Woody had somehow made its way to Arizona. So he receives it in 1949. It probably was here at Hudson for a little bit, but we can find out in early 50 it's already in Arizona. Well, it was on the ranch when Charlie dies in 59. Yvette sold it a few years after that and sold it to a fire chief in Arizona. And this fire chief decided, you know, this would make an interesting fire wagon, so they painted it red and put a siren on it. But a Dodge Power Wagon has a top speed of, you know, maybe 45 miles an hour. I mean, it's not a race vehicle. So it ultimately goes into a garage. Recently, I learned that a guy in Michigan who was a collector of Power Wagons, had no interest in Charlie Ward, didn't know who Charlie Ward was, but discovers this, rescues it, has it shipped to Michigan, has it restored. And this is what it looks like today. It's all fully restored. I've communicated this guy, and guess what? This Power Wagon has an inscription on the dash, a metal plate, given to Charlie Ward by the grateful employees of Brown and Bigelow. So that Power Wagon that originated in Hudson, Wisconsin, made its way to Arizona, then made its way to Michigan, is fully restored, and it's now for sale. And the only catch in this whole thing is that the guy wants $150,000 for it. I'd love to buy it and bring it to Hudson. But at $150,000, let's admit it's way out of my league. But it's another mystery. And the mystery is, how did this vehicle make that kind of trek, and now it's in Michigan, and there it is, and it really ought to have a connection to Hudson. So Charlie Ward left a lot of questions unanswered, but as you earlier said in your introduction, certainly a colorful part of Hudson's past, and I think the record is pretty clear that he was good for Hudson. They supported Hudson and contributed to Hudson and gave back to the community.
Well, as many mysteries as may be left, you've cleared up, I think, quite a few with your research. And I just want to thank you for doing all this and taking this to heart and discovering all you've discovered about an interesting Hudson character.
It's been fun.
Thanks, Daryl.
Steve, thank you.